As a janitor only 1.35 meters tall, this man spent his entire life enduring humiliation and insults from others. But everything came to an end one night. With the aid of a highly toxic chemical waste, he was transformed into a monster known as the Toxic Avenger, not only immune to blades and bullets, but also gifted with terrifying self-healing powers, and even his urine carried a frighteningly corrosive effect. Yet even at that point, there were still people who dared to bully him, which was nothing short of courting death. However, the corporation's big boss had his eyes on the mutation inside him, and a violent clash was inevitable. The story begins on a stormy night, with journalist Mel secretly investigating a massive conglomerate called BTH, a company involved in countless industries. It was said that in order to increase profits, the group dumped pollutants without restraint. But in reality, the city's problems went far beyond industrial pollution, with corruption among officials, gangs running rampant, and ordinary citizens living in fear and chaos. As an award-winning investigative reporter, Mel was determined to expose the city's darkest side. At this time, rookie reporter JJ approached Mel. Through undercover digging, she discovered undeniable evidence in BTH's internal system, showing that the company's reckless pollution had caused irreversible harm to both animals and humans nearby. Mel was overjoyed when he saw it, convinced that with such evidence, destroying the corporation would be no problem. But before they could celebrate for long, a group of uninvited thugs stormed in. Mel immediately realized these were enforcers sent by BTH, so he quickly shoved the USB drive into JJ's hands and told her to run while he distracted them. With the situation so urgent, JJ dared not hesitate for a second. She grabbed the drive and bolted, only to run straight into more attackers. Desperate, she leapt down to the first floor, and before the enemies could react, she pushed through the pain and ran with the evidence. Meanwhile, Mel was cornered in a room by the thugs, and he defiantly told them, "You can't do anything to me." But the men fired without mercy, and Mel collapsed instantly. The next second, however, he rose to his feet again, saying coldly, "You're nothing special," until one attacker shot him with a spear gun, sending him crashing out the window and landing on the ground right in front of JJ. She was so terrified that her scalp tingled, and she ran even faster for her life. Racing along the railway tracks, she finally managed to escape pursuit. The next day, in another corner of the city, Winston groggily woke up, gazing at a family photo on the table, and began to miss his late wife once again. Back then, his wife had brought her son when she married Winston, forming a happy blended family. But good days didn't last long, as she soon passed away, leaving Winston and his stepson Wade to depend on each other. Sighing heavily, Winston quickly got up to make breakfast for Wade. At that moment, the television was filled with overwhelming advertisements for BTH products, something Winston had long grown accustomed to. After hurriedly finishing breakfast preparations, Wade sat down after washing up, but when he picked up the charred bread, he found it nearly impossible to swallow. Barely forcing down the meal, Winston prepared to take his son to school. But as soon as they stepped outside, they saw their neighbor Daisy being threatened by a thug. The man held Daisy's cat and forced her to sell her land and house at a dirt-cheap price. Winston quickly looked away, clearly too afraid to intervene. But the thug was even more malicious. Though Daisy had already agreed to sell, he deliberately tossed her cat into the road before leaving. Winston saves the cat just before it gets hit and returns it to Daisy. Even so, Wade was angry at Winston's earlier cowardice, insisting he should not have stood by while Daisy was bullied. Winston hurried to explain that sometimes doing nothing was actually better, but in his youthful temper, Wade couldn't understand. He thought his stepfather only knew how to avoid problems and wasn't a real man. The two ended up parting on bad terms. Afterward, Winston drove to his job at the BTH factory. Although he was short and disabled, unable to take on regular positions, he could still handle cleaning and odd jobs. Yet fate seemed determined to torment him. While working, he suddenly got a call from the hospital saying the results of his brain scan were in, and the problem was extremely serious, urging him to come in immediately. Rushing to the hospital, Winston met with Dr. Walla, who glanced at his file and asked if Wade was still receiving psychological counseling, to which Winston nodded heavily. Dr. Walla sighed and said, "Single parents are heroes, but single stepfathers are double heroes." Before displaying Winston's brain scan, he explained that Winston's brain tumor was already in its late stage. Winston's ears buzzed, overwhelmed with terror, unable to hear what was being said. When he came back to his senses, Dr. Walla was explaining that surgery was no longer an option, and at best, Winston had 6 months to a year left to live. Winston felt the entire world spinning, wondering why all misfortune had to fall on him. At that moment, Dr. Walla mentioned there was another treatment option, trying a new drug just launched by BTH. However, the drug is extremely expensive, but if Winston has BTH insurance, it might be covered. As a factory employee, Winston had been paying for the company's platinum insurance plan, so he felt he had finally grabbed a lifeline and quickly called the insurance consultant. But the response was shocking. The consultant regretfully told him that coverage for the drug was included under the gold plan, not the platinum plan. Though Winston had platinum insurance, it did not include the benefits of the gold plan. In other words, even though he had insurance, it would not cover the drug costs. The news hit him like a bolt from the blue. Meanwhile, inside a heavily guarded mansion, BTH's boss Bob was undergoing a bizarre treatment, transfusing himself with the blood of young people to maintain his youth. Afterward, Bob summoned Fritz, the handler of the band Killer Nuts. The very thugs who killed Mel were members of this band, hired by Bob to silence Mel and JJ, who had the evidence. But Bob had not expected them to botch the job so badly, failing to deal with just 2 people, and even allowing JJ to escape with the proof. Furious, he glared at Fritz, warning him to capture JJ immediately and clean up the mess or face his wrath. Fritz turned pale and promised to take care of it. He rushed to the band's hideout, ordering them to set out at once. The Nuts members drove a car full of arrogance straight to JJ's house, but she was watching from nearby, and they ended up empty-handed. Once she confirmed they had left, JJ returned home, pulled a backpack from its hiding spot under the floorboards, and without looking back, left the house behind. At the same time, the school was holding a talent election, and Wade, who had always dreamed of performing, naturally signed up to participate. Unfortunately, Wade suffered from psychological illness, making it impossible for him to perform in front of an audience. So, once again, he failed. Afterward, Wade watched the published video of the event, and when he saw the slightly malicious comments online, his heart sank in defeat. That evening, when Winston checked his account, as expected, the balance had dropped into the negatives, and life for father and son had already fallen into hardship. Winston sighed and opened the news page, but before he could read further, Daisy came by to drop Wade off at home, reminding Winston that Wade seemed especially down today, so something must have happened. After Daisy left, Winston took the initiative to ask his son. Looking at Wade's unusual silence, Winston immediately understood what the problem was. Winston then spoke of his late wife, who used to be a guitarist, not particularly skilled, but it was all about the attitude. To cheer up his son, Winston turned on loud music and even put on a ridiculous skirt to dance around. Seeing his father act so comically, Wade finally couldn't help but laugh. But in the next moment, he noticed Winston had forgotten to hide his medical report. Winston quickly snatched it back, terrified to stay in the room, unsure how to answer his son's question of what is in that report. So Winston rushed out of the house in a panic. Just then, he recalled the news he had seen earlier on the computer. Company boss Bob was hosting an awards banquet that very night. Clinging to his last hope, Winston went there. Meanwhile, Bob sat at a table with his assistant Kissy, the mayor, and other officials. Because of a string of negative reports, the company's reputation was struggling, so Bob hoped this event would boost their image, allowing him to continue selling poor-quality products to the public. As they spoke, Bob suddenly noticed Spence, the son of local mob boss Barkabas, staring at him and smiling from across the room. Bob had no choice but to excuse himself and sit down in front of Barkabas. In truth, Bob's chance to sit with the mayor tonight had been purchased with Barkabas's money. Recently, with BTH struggling financially, Bob had borrowed heavily from the mob, but the repayment was due and he had no means to pay it back. Barkabas told Bob to clean up the scandals, fix the crisis completely, and repay the debt quickly, or face the consequences. Bob could only grit his teeth and agree. He then returned to the stage, forced a smile, and accepted the Outstanding Entrepreneur trophy personally handed to him by the mayor, hoping it might salvage some reputation. At that moment, Winston had already slipped into the banquet. As soon as Bob returns to his seat, Winston approaches him, mustering the courage to make his request. He explained that he had worked diligently for the company for 13 years, now raising his underage son alone, only to be diagnosed with cancer. Yet the medical insurance he had purchased could not cover his treatment, so he begged Bob for help, asking if the company could make an exception. Bob instantly replied with warmth, saying it was no problem. He would help Winston, and then promptly had Kissy escort the grateful janitor out. But as soon as Winston walked out the door, he overheard Kissy sneer, calling him a fool. She then ordered that Winston be fired and rehired, which would conveniently prevent the company from paying any of his medical costs. Furious, Winston resolved to fight for himself, and that very night, he drove to the factory. What he didn't know was that JJ also had her eyes on the factory. The moment Winston opened the gate, JJ slipped inside, planning to collect chemical waste as evidence. But the second she entered, Fritz received word, and he immediately sent the Killer Nuts members to eliminate her. Meanwhile, Winston dipped his mop into the highly corrosive liquid and used it as a weapon to force a coworker to open the vault. After stuffing a trash bag full of cash, he fled. At the same time, JJ had just stolen the waste liquid, and the two crashed right into each other. JJ's bottle shattered, spilling the liquid onto the money, which quickly corroded into nothing, leaving both of them stunned. Just then, the Killer Nuts arrived. Seeing this, JJ quickly scrambled out of the factory, but Winston, short and small, couldn't get out. As he tried to speak to them, a bullet hit him in the head. By the time Fritz realized they had shot the wrong person, Winston was already lying lifeless on the ground. Fritz, enraged, ordered them to dispose of the body immediately. And so, JJ watched with her own eyes as Winston was thrown into the chemical waste. But Winston was not destroyed. Instead, he was reborn, although his face was completely disfigured, looking just like a monster. When Winston climbed out of the toxic pool, seeing his reflection, then looking at the grotesque mutant bird nearby, he let out a heartbreaking roar. After venting his rage, Winston quietly slipped back to his apartment building, where he happened to see Daisy signing a land sale contract with Spence. With no energy to care, he climbed up to his window and saw his son anxiously calling him on the phone, which warmed his heart and brought a smile to his face. But when Wade saw a monster hanging outside the window, he immediately grabbed a box and hurled it at Winston, causing Winston to fall right onto Spence's car. Hearing the noise, Spence came to investigate, only to find his car smashed by the deformed figure, and he exploded with rage, drawing his gun. The bullets had no effect on Winston, whose wounds healed instantly. Realizing his new power, Winston lunged forward, ripped Spence's arm off, and slipped away before the police could arrive, vanishing into the forest to escape pursuit. The next morning, Winston awoke in a homeless camp. It turned out a drifter named Guthrie had found him and brought him back. Seeing Guthrie show no disgust toward him, Winston poured out his troubles. After hearing everything, Guthrie asked Winston, "Even if you only had 1 year left, so what? Everyone dies, it's just a matter of when. So are you really going to give up because of this?" Guthrie even shared his own story. He had once been a high-paid elite doctor, but after being falsely accused, he lost everything and ended up on the streets. Yet he never abandoned himself. Guthrie asked Winston what he truly wanted. Winston said he wanted his son, but his son thought he was a monster. Guthrie firmly disagreed. "You are not a monster." When Winston looked up, he saw his mop, which Guthrie had found by the lake and now returned to him. He told Winston, "With great power comes great responsibility. If you want to win your son back, go do good deeds and prove yourself." Suddenly enlightened, Winston took his mop and left without looking back. At that moment, a group of armed political extremists had taken hostages inside a restaurant, now locked in a standoff with police. The cause of their rage was absurd. It was because the restaurant had changed its mascot from a man to a woman. Just as the thugs were about to slaughter the hostages, the Toxic Avenger walked in with his magic mop and delivered a crushing blow to the leader. Then the police saw blood splattering across the restaurant windows, and soon, several of the thugs were wiped out. After the hostages were rescued safely, they all saw the Toxic Avenger as a hero. And Wade also saw this scene on television, and only when the monster spoke did Wade recognize that it was his dad. At the same time, Spence told his father that it was this monster who had torn off his arm, so Barkabas immediately gathered his men, preparing to make Winston pay the price. At the same time, Bob also saw the news, and he was furious, wanting to rip every hair out of Fritz's head. How could such a small task go wrong again and again? By now, Bob had realized that the janitor and the freak were the same person. Something must have gone wrong to trigger this second mutation. So Bob rushed to the lab and demanded the researchers give him a reasonable explanation. The researcher had no choice but to gently explain that factory waste usually contained deadly toxins, which would absolutely cause harmful side effects in ordinary people. But if combined with an extremely rare gene, it could trigger a powerful mutation. That was the reason Winston had become strong. Hearing this, Bob immediately had another idea. This was the perfect chance to make the company profitable again. Since the researchers could not reproduce the mutation, Bob ordered his men to capture Winston alive for further study. At that moment, Fritz reminded Bob that Winston had a precious son. Meanwhile, JJ brought the ID card she had picked up that night and went directly to Wade, telling him the truth about what had happened. Now, if JJ wanted to expose BTH further, Winston would be the key. But the next second, the Killer Nuts stormed into the house, and JJ and Wade fled for their lives. During the chase, the band's leader Bud planted a tracker onto Wade's sock. Soon after, Wade ran into Winston on his way home. Father and son finally reunited after all the hardships, and both understood each other's struggles, at last able to talk calmly. But soon Barkabas's men arrived. Winston was shot and fell to the ground. JJ quickly dragged Wade to escape, yet Winston healed his wound almost instantly and struck back at those who had fired at him. At the same time, the killer nuts tracked Wade using the signal, and one of them shot JJ, knocking her to the floor. In the end, Wade was captured and locked inside a dark room in Bob's house. Completely unaware, Winston was still fighting off gang members, picking them off one by one, then stealing a car and finding the dying JJ. He carried her back to the forest, pressed his blood onto her gunshot wound, and saved her life. When JJ woke up, she sincerely thanked him, then told him Wade had been taken. Winston understood that Bob's real target was him. JJ said gravely, "They are dangerous. We have to hit them hard." Winston shot back instantly. "I am already hard enough. It's time they got a taste of it." Soon the band held another performance, and JJ sneaked backstage, tampering with the microphone wires. As Bud sang, he suddenly realized the mic had no sound. The next second, the Toxic Avenger grabbed the microphone and began to rap. The audience, seeing it was him, erupted into cheers, furious. Bud drew his gun and fired but failed to kill, and instead had half his head sliced off by a mop. The crowd screamed and scattered, the scene descending into chaos. Winston pressed forward unhurriedly, and within a few breaths, he had slain every member of the Killer Nuts on stage. He then took the microphone again and told the remaining crowd that these men were hired killers for BTH, and that the company's boss Bob was working with gangsters, selling dangerous products, harming citizens, making fortunes, and walking away free. He urged them to unite and fight against such evil. Just then, JJ caught the last band member, and after pulling off his chicken head mask, she discovered that he was a deformed man. Forced by Winston, the man revealed Bob's hiding place. JJ and Winston quickly arrived there, and very smoothly they found Bob. But suddenly the nearby statue began releasing smoke, and both JJ and Winston collapsed unconscious. When Winston woke again, he was chained in a secret lab. The chains were made of triple-layer titanium alloy, impossible to break even with his strength. Bob stood proudly and told Winston, "You're about to make me rich." Winston panicked, but the chains held him tight, so he could only roar back, "When I get out, you'll pay for this." Bob laughed gleefully, clearly convinced Winston would never escape, and strutted out of the lab. Moments later, researchers began live experiments on Winston, inserting extraction devices into his body, and streams of blood flowed into transparent tubes. After 3 attempts, they finally extracted blood carrying the mutation factor. Ignoring the researchers' warnings, Bob took the unfinished liquid back to his room, but to his shock, Barkabas and his men were already waiting inside. With Winston's exposure, Bob's company reputation had collapsed completely, and the mayor quickly distanced himself. Seeing no way to recover, Barkabas came to collect the debt. Bob quickly held up the liquid, claiming he had discovered a new substance that would solve everything, but Barkabas ignored him. Cornered, Bob downed the bottle in one gulp. His body reacted instantly. Feeling his strength surge, Bob swiftly slaughtered Barkabas and his men. By the time Kissy arrived, it was all over. She rushed to the windowsill and poured the remaining liquid into her mouth. No matter what, she wanted to stay with her love, Bob. Soon, Kissy's body also mutated, and she ordered the researchers to stabilize Bob's condition and eliminate all other witnesses, including JJ and Wade. But Fritz refused to harm the boy, unwilling to admit that Bob was still his brother. Kissy flew into a rage, snatched Fritz's cane, and struck his body with all her strength. When JJ heard they were going to kill Wade, she quickly woke the unconscious Winston, but they still could not break free from the restraints. Suddenly, a flash of inspiration struck Winston. He remembered that his urine had extremely corrosive power, so he aimed at the chains and released a stream, and the chains instantly corroded and broke apart. Winston leaped up and then helped JJ remove her chains. JJ immediately swiped the lab's main computer to use as solid evidence against Bob. Winston smashed through the door, grabbed his mop, and rushed into the yard just before his son could be killed. He had just taken down one assassin when another pulled the trigger and hit the gas tank, and in the next second, the small cabin was blown into fragments. Winston felt his heart stop in that moment, and memories of life with his stepson flashed before his eyes. Just as Winston was overwhelmed with grief and anger, the mutated Bob appeared in his sight. He immediately charged at him with his mop, and the two instantly engaged in a fierce fight. One swung a mop, the other an axe, and for a while neither could overpower the other. They fought all the way from the top of the slope to the bottom, yet still no clear winner emerged. Elsewhere, JJ was gasping as she loaded the computer into the car, but Kissy suddenly ambushed her. The two women shoved each other back and forth, and when Kissy was distracted by the fight on Bob's side, JJ knocked her out with a toilet bowl. By now, Winston and Bob's fight had reached its peak, and just as Bob swung his axe down at Winston, JJ smashed him in the stomach with the toilet, sending him howling to the ground. But Bob quickly recovered, swinging his axe back at Winston, who dodged and pinned Bob down, raining punches onto him. Just as Winston was about to finish Bob, he suddenly heard his son's voice. It turned out Fritz had seized the chance to rescue the boy. Seeing that his son was still alive, Winston stopped his attack. Wade did not want his father to keep killing, and Winston promised to listen to him. But when Bob tried to attack again, Winston hurled him onto a car hood. With JJ starting the car, Bob was blasted apart instantly. But before father and son could speak, Kissy struck again, slashing Fritz. Winston completely lost his patience, and during the fight, a nearby barrel of waste fluid ignited, flames roaring skyward. Sometime later, JJ publicly exposed BTH's crimes, and the mayor and police chief who had protected them were taken away for investigation. Because Winston had saved many lives, the federal investigators decided not to pursue his killings. And there was more good news thanks to Winston's mutation. The tumor in his brain had vanished, meaning he could live to see Wade grow up. In this way, Winston became the hero of the entire city. Fritz also miraculously survived. Guthrie adopted the mutated bird, and Wade finally overcame his psychological barriers and stepped onto the stage of his dreams. That is where the story ends. This remake completely overturns the brainless action framework of the old version, giving flesh and depth to the revenge tale of this green-skinned monster. In the original, the Toxic Avenger was a pure machine of vengeance, but in the new version, Winston Gooze, played by Peter Dinklage, was already a man crushed by life even before his mutation. Unemployment, cancer, and his stepson's resentment toward him gave real weight to his anger. When he plunged into the toxic vat and became the green-skinned monster, what the audience saw was no longer just a power upgrade, but a working-class man, beaten down by society, finally snapping completely. With his small frame, he carried a story of resistance from the bottom, of family bonds, and of self-acceptance, and in the blood-soaked chaos, this green monster truly touched the warmth of humanity. Alright, that's all for today's video. Thank you for watching. Your likes, comments, and subscriptions are the greatest encouragement for us, and we'll see you next time.